So hello everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Cultural Linguistics. And as you may guess from the music, this week's edition is about cultural linguistics and political discourse. So how our cultural conceptualizations can influence our political decisions, how political misunderstandings can come about through distortions in the media, through the lack of equivalent political expressions in different languages, and even the ways that the same language can interpret one political conceptualization in different ways. So we're going to look specifically at 5 examples. First, the conceptualizations of compromise and concession, and then the conceptualization of democracy, then the cultural metaphor of the nation as a body, then the conceptualization of austerity, so the policy of austerity and how it is perceived in different cultures based on their conceptualizations. And finally, we're going to look at some conceptualizations in military English. Okay, so the notions of compromise and concession are associated with cultural conceptualizations that go back to 19th century liberalism and the secularism that most Western democracies were founded upon. So they're linked with beliefs which elevated the status of the individual and fostered the idea of contractual relations between free agents and commerce, which obviously made the system of capitalism possible. So if you watched the video that I asked you to look at last time for homework, where Tom Holland was talking about his book Dominion, the making of the Western mind and the influence that Christianity had upon Western democracy. In this book, he talks about how the concept of secularism really developed out of Christian history and basically out of the struggle between the Catholic Church and the European monarchies. So there was a Pope, Gregory VII, who wanted to show that his authority was higher than that of the French King Henry IV. And so basically he encouraged the peasants to rebel against the king. So he tried to undermine the king's authority to show that the authority of the church was higher. So this power struggle between the Catholic Church and the European monarchies is what ultimately led to this concept of the separation between church and state in the U.S. Constitution, and that which prevails in most Western democracies now. Okay, so this term secularism was first popularized in 1846 by an English newspaper editor. And secularism had come to stand for this sort of neutrality. But secularism ultimately is not a neutral concept. So this idea that there are twin dimensions, the secular and the religious, is just an assumption that goes back again to this struggle between the Catholic Church and the European monarchies. Okay, so in cultures where they don't have this clear separation between church and state, between the religious and the secular, so basically where they believe that the spiritual still very much influences everyday happenings, everyday life, they don't really have the same conceptualization of a political concession or a political compromise. in those cultural environments, making a concession or making a compromise could be seen as sort of morally untenable, as in a way kind of blasphemy or kind of an injury to the divine or to the spiritual world. So, as we understand concession in the Western world, we see the individual as somebody who is in control of certain affairs, and this gives us the authority to grant certain rights to others, including when this action is perceived as detrimental, as something that could harm us, or even a sign of weakness or a loss to us. But since we don't tend to perceive ourselves or our government as being representatives of God, of the divine, this is easier to do. So an example of this from the British monarchy, obviously the British monarchy has over the years learned to compromise, learn to change, learn to adapt, and live in this system of democracy somehow. But there are still certain areas where the King or Queen of England is expected to act as if they are the representative of God on earth. And one such example is before the Second World War, when the current Queen Elizabeth's uncle, Edward, came to the throne. His rule was very short. It was cut short because he fell in love with a divorced American woman, and he wanted to marry her at all costs. So basically he was given the choice between marrying this divorced woman that he loved and the crown and continuing to reign as king, because he was told, as the King of England, he is the direct representative of God on earth, so he couldn't make a moral compromise like that. So Edward ultimately chose to marry the woman that he loved, and he abdicated. He gave up the throne, and because of that, his younger brother Albert, who became George VI, inherited the throne, and then after that, the current queen, his first child, his daughter Elizabeth. Okay, so that's just an example of where a concession or a compromise could not be made because of the understanding that the political authority was the representative of a higher spiritual authority. Okay, now let's look a little bit closer at the concept of democracy, how it has come to be understood in the West, and how it is understood specifically in Ghana. The key pillars of democracy include citizen participation. So citizens are part of the decision-making process on matters that affect them. And the decision-making process involves a two-way consultative process, communication between the ruled and the rulers. Okay, then secondly, political tolerance. Democracy accommodates different viewpoints, worldviews within society. And then finally, human rights. And these include such things as individual citizens' fundamental rights to life, freedom of speech, and so on. Okay, so everyone internationally pretty much agrees that these are the basic ingredients of democracy, but how they should be broken down and how they should practically be put into use, how they should be implemented, these are things that are more disputed. Okay, so we're going to look particularly at the understanding of freedom of speech in Ghana. Okay, so the notion of freedom of speech, which is closely associated with the concept of democracy, may be loosely defined as being able to speak freely without censorship or limitation. But this concept of the freedom of speech, as it is defined here, is inherently contradictory to the foundations of traditional societies in Ghana, where the common good of society is elevated above that of any single individual, and where each person's individuality or self-identity is immersed in the society. So, the Ghanaian cultural scheme of impoliteness or politeness encourages the mitigation through the use of apologetics or indirectness of any act of communication that could be interpreted as face-threatening. Democracy and freedom of speech need to be exercised within the limits of Ghanaian politeness norms. And I just want to note here that even in the West, many times we struggle to define what freedom of speech really looks like, how it should practically be carried out, whether the right to freedom of speech should include such things as hate speech or the right to propagate false news, share fake news websites, or to propagate false facts about situations. So the freedom of speech even here is a greatly disputed issue. But in Ghana, specifically, it raises concerns about the individual's relationship to the whole, the individual's place in society, whether the rights of the individual to express themselves overrule the greater good of the society at large. Okay, so Ghanaian cultural schemas of polite political discourse involve avoidance of open critical discourses in the face of authority. Okay, so here the question is a little bit different than in Western democracies because they still have this concept of the respect of elders, so not really wanting to humiliate someone who is perceived as older than you, even in political discourse, so not speaking badly or even criticizing your political opponent. And they also in Ghana still preserve the institution of chieftaincy. So even though the tribal chiefs don't necessarily have direct political power, they're still very much recognized by society as a whole, and are not to be questioned or criticized. So the people still very much have this mindset. Okay. All right, let's move on to the cultural metaphor of the nation as a body. So the nation as a body is lexicalized in English in the phrase body politic, which belongs to a whole field of expressions that refer to political entities in terms of bodily organs and functions, such as a head of state, a head of government, long arm of the law, the organ of a party, a sclerosis or tumor of the body politic, and others. The phrase body politic appears to have originated in the early 16th century as a loan translation of the Latin phrase corpus politicum, and was used to describe the political role of the king as opposed to his physical identity, and by extension the monarchical state in England. Okay, so again it goes back to this notion of the king or the queen, the royal head of state, as not belonging just properly to themselves, but being kind of a medium for the divine, for God. So the king has this physical identity, so his own physical body, but then at the same time, he's also a conduit for God, for a representation of God on earth. All right. So a study which examined participants from 10 different countries revealed the emergence of two dominant patterns of interpretation. So one of them is the nation as a geobody, and the other one is the nation as a functional whole, a whole organic physical body. So the nation as a geobody was represented more in China. So for example, Beijing was seen as the heart of the country. So it dominates the whole country and symbolizes life, whereas Chengdu City was imagined as the right hand of China, the city of Shanghai as the left hand of China, and these hands represent sort of the economic centers for the body of China. And then Hainan Island was depicted as the right foot and Taiwan as the left foot. And the feet being those entities which help China to stand up in the world. Okay, then the nation as a whole, as a functional whole, was represented by students in England who responded that the Queen of England represents the head of the body, as she is in charge of the whole country and she is royalty. And the features of the head, the eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, are represented by different official people, such as the Prime Minister and other government officials. Okay, a couple of examples from German and French. In German, they have three words for describing the nation as a body. So the one that is most commonly used is Staatskörper, which literally means state body. Then they also have politische Körper, which literally means political body. And this is more used in theoretical terms. So the Staatskörper would be used to talk about the real representatives of government, and then politische Körper would be used to talk about it, about the institution of government more in general, in theoretical terms. And then finally, from their history, they have the word Volkskörper, which literally means people's body, and this one has a more pejorative meaning, a negative meaning, as it was used by the Nazis for their propaganda against the Jews when they tried to depict them as kind of an infection or a parasite in the body politic, something that had to be gotten rid of for the health of the body. All right, and then in French, they have two concepts. The corps social, which literally means the body social, and then the corps politique, which literally means the political body. And interestingly, in French, these two terms are often used interchangeably. So this very much reflects their mentality, their history, their revolutionary history of rebelling against authority, of overthrowing the monarchy, and of liberté, égalité, fraternité. So everybody is the same, everybody is at the same level. Okay? All right, now let's take a look at this concept of austerity, so this economic policy of austerity, and different understandings of it. So you may not know what austerity is, or you may only know the word austere, which means very strict, very severe. But austerity measures in economics are the response of a government whose public debt is so large that the risk of default or the inability to service the required payments on its debt obligations becomes a real possibility. So when governments are doing so poorly financially, when they have great debts and they're afraid that they might not be able to pay it back, that they might have to default on their loans, then they implement austerity measures. So basically they cut back on public spending and try to raise government income, raise taxes. Okay, so a 2017 study found these three conceptualizations of austerity in the press in Portugal, in Spain, and Ireland. In Portugal, the predominant reaction to austerity measures was rather one of a deep conservative morality of self-discipline and punishment, whereas in Spain, there was a strong sense of outrage against austerity measures and the country's creditors. And then in Ireland, the idea that the crisis and its effects were hitting the country, but not hitting it as hard as they do elsewhere, prevailed. Okay? So, obviously, these reactions to austerity are not only based on cultural conceptualizations, they're also based on the exact measures that the government took, the economic situation that the country was in when the austerity measures were introduced. But cultural conceptualizations also contribute to how people react to government policies. So, certain political ideological conceptualizations allow governments to legitimize economic and political measures. Before a government puts a policy into effect, they need to consider their history, they need to consider the current situation, how their measures will be perceived, how people will react based on their cultural conceptualizations. Okay, and then finally, I wanted to talk just a little bit about military English. So military English not only refers to a particular variety of English, but also to a context of the use of English. So a way that English is understood in countries where it is not the native language. So similar to, for example, how democracy is understood in Ghana, as we talked about before. And in particular, one very recent example of this is the use of English between Allied forces and the natives of Iraq. Okay? So speakers in military contexts usually come from various cultural backgrounds, and they're therefore very likely to draw on different systems of cultural conceptualization. All right, and one example of this in American military culture, there is such a thing as solatia, which comes from Latin and is related to the word consolation in English. So something that gives you comfort. And in the American military, this policy or this concept of solatia is the payment of money to the relatives of civilian victims of fighting between the American military and the local rebels. So this policy was implemented in Korea, and the military was also authorized to implement it in Afghanistan and Iraq. But at first in Iraq, when it was presented to the people as an expression of remorse or sympathy for people who had been killed accidentally, civilians who were killed accidentally, it was not really welcomed by the locals. And then when the military presented it in a different way, presented it as dia, or blood money given as compensation, then it was much more welcomed or accepted, because the local people had this concept already, this concept of dia. So this was tied to systems of inter-clan relationship in their history, and it is understood as blood money given as compensation for an accidental killing. So not an expression of sympathy or compassion, but rather as compensation. So when it was presented to them in this way, then they accepted it, then it worked. Okay. All right, so that's all I wanted to present to you today about cultural linguistics and political discourse, how it helps us to understand international political relations in a better way. I hope this presentation helped you. And as always, I will post your homework on Edmodo, and the presentation will also be posted on the department website. Okay, so we have 2 more installments of our Friday lecture to go, and I hope all of you are staying well. Okay, have a nice weekend. Take care. Bye-bye.